there's going to be some uneasy conversations, you know, and I'm willing to be unpopular in those conversations because I'm thinking about the children who reside in these underserved, under-resourced, and underrepresented communities, who have high teacher turnovers, who have 30, 40, 50 students in class, who are experiencing unemployment, loss of businesses, and you know, who are strapped for cash and are going through issues of poverty and homelessness, right? I'm thinking about that lens. I'm not thinking about how cute we can make ourselves look. This is life and death for a lot of children. So I don't have time to be popular and make decisions that are going to be comfortable because I'm thinking about the children who can't breathe. And if I have to be unpopular doing that, then I would rather the leadership understand where I'm situated in this work, because I don't have a long time here on this earth. None of us do. And so while I'm here, it needs to be of impact, it needs to make a difference, and it needs to create transformation in the lives of the communities that we serve, you know? And so when you're speaking like that, when you're talking like that, there are some who will be on board. There are others who are not ready yet. And so that's the place that we find ourselves in as we navigate those politics, Dr. Beachum.
Preach, preach. I mean,
those questions take me there, man. It really does. I mean, yeah, that's but I'm glad that I went through that journey. I'm happy right now being an associate professor and getting more. I've always been an associate professor, but getting back more into that strict role, and my reset button. And this might answer one of the other questions, but I'm also, interestingly enough, I'll be on sabbatical in the fall as well.
Okay.
And I'm very excited about that. So.
Me too. So am I. So am I. But yeah, and even if sometimes when, you know, my philosophy in many cases is evolution as opposed to revolution. Because sometimes when you're, you know, the lone voice up against the machine, the organization, the entire structure, you can't go in and just, you know, cause revolution and expect everybody's just gonna, you know, just roll over and everything's gonna change in one day. It's not gonna happen. The cultural press in most cases will press against you and get you out of there. So therefore, even when sometimes you have to subscribe to a philosophy of, well, how can I maneuver in ways to change the system from within? And Michael Eric Dyson talks about this idea of sort of Trojan horse kind of philosophy. You know, you got to get in the system, deep in the system, and then change systems from within. And many times without, you know, folks consciously knowing that this is going on. But even sometimes if you do that, and even if you're not, you know, boisterous or aggressive or any of these things, you're still a problem, because ideologically and the way that you still positioned yourself, you know, speaking on behalf of, you know, disparate communities and vulnerable communities, even in milder tones, is still problematic in many cases. And, you know, you still bump up against the power structure, and you still will feel sanctions in various kinds of ways that can be career limiting. And I've realized now with time that, you know, some things have probably been career limiting for me. But like I think you said it best, but that's okay. That's okay, because at the right time I did the right thing for the right reasons. And in the long run, if it is meant to be, then it's meant to be. That's certainly fine. You know, because I think we got to have we have to look down the tunnel of time, right? Because this battle, the struggle is not for just the day. The struggle is the long-term sort of struggle, right? For this generation, for the next generation, and so on and so forth. All right, Tashina, I know I went on for a while.
Oh my gosh, please. I mean, this is such valuable and important topics, and I'm just grateful that we have this space to share this knowledge here. And I'm grateful to be a part of this. And just thinking about all of your wisdom that you're sharing with us today, Dr. Prier, those who have the privilege to just be able to really intellectualize what prophetic criticism or being a prophetic critic is. It really is just, a privilege to be able to do that, but you really have the courage and the strength to be able to remind others and use your space in which you're working to remind those that it's not just a concept or an idea. These are actual people that are being affected by this. Look, I mean, yes, you can look at the statistics, but remember that these are actually people's lives that are being affected.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think when we begin to see students as persons, as people, right, as subjects who have something to offer rather than being objects and constantly being acted on, right? And when we see the students and the communities themselves as a part of the building of the knowledge production, right? And informing how we continue to rethink what K through 12 schools can be, then I think we'll get a little bit more closer to a more inclusive education. And so, yeah, so I'm very much a believer in theory to practice and practice to theory to make this work come alive. And, sometimes when individuals are hearing fancy kinds of words or just these multi-layered kinds of ways in which we try to describe systems, this is not pie in the sky stuff. This is real stuff that affects real people's lives, and systems are social structures in which power is always at play. Certain kinds of interests are always at play. And to pretend that these are neutral systems, no, there are always people within the system of power that are making decisions about the kind of curriculum that needs to be dispensed, about the kind of pedagogy that would be embraced, about the kind of competencies that pre-service teachers would have to adopt. All of those are selected and ordered decisions. And if those are selected and ordered decisions, then knowledge is not static. Knowledge is socially constructed. Not meaning that it's not real, it's just socially constructed. We select and order what we choose to privilege and validate over other kinds of ways of knowing. And so once we demystify this idea that we're in a neutral or objective system, then we can get down to the nitty-gritty of examining the cultural politics of education. And how do we then make the best decisions on behalf of teachers and school leaders and kids and the communities that they serve.
And talking about this makes me think about the article, Dr. Beachum, that you shared with me the other day in Idaho. Could you talk about that a little bit, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I will. And actually, I was gonna I was gonna change up my next question to that question, but yeah, just yesterday, Dr. Prier, I shared an article with Tashina, and it's going to appear on the Education for the 21st Century Facebook page. For those of out there who follow our Facebook page, well, we're going to put that article out there. There's an article that the state of Idaho is attempting to ban their Congress, their state government is attempting to ban critical race theory at public schools and public universities. Now, this is a continuation of something that started under the last administration with regard to, an attack on critical race theory. And what we also saw was the banning of diversity-related training in the federal government. That has been, overturned. However, now at the state level, it looks like the culture wars and the ideological wars will continue at the state level. I was particularly upset at the first time when it happened federally, and I'm upset at this too, because it's pinpointing, it's actually targeting critical race theory, naming it, and going after universities too, when universities are indeed a place for intellectual space, discourse, conversation, research, engagement, and all these kinds of things. So the first thing I want is, okay, how can you do that?
Right.
But can you maybe speak to, and like I said, this question, this is an off the cuff one here. Can you speak to the current attack on critical theory and critical theories, especially critical race theory? Because to me, it feels like, and then we'll have to send you this too, because the way that they positioned it in Idaho, they position it in a way in which they try to say that critical race theory is in fact racist, so to speak. Because you investigate race, or because you question, American history, American superiority, and all these kinds of things, it is un-American.
Right.
So maybe you can speak to this if you've given this some thought.
Absolutely. So I didn't get a chance, in full disclosure, to read the article yet. I did see, I think, something come across my screen about it, but I haven't got a chance to read it yet. But based on what you're saying, I have the general gist. What I will say is that part of where this started is during the Trump administration, if you all will recall, is he took a public stance against critical race theory, right? And so thus began the attack on critical race theory. And what will happen on a lot of the media channels is there's no explanation about what the discourse is.
Right.
They just say critical race theory, right? And it sounds like some boogeyman. And so the nation was founded upon race. It wasn't persons of color who instituted race, right? The nation itself, when it decided to have dark persons or persons of color, right, as property, right, for a free labor economy, they instituted race. Just because you don't say it doesn't mean that you didn't institute it. But we also know that they said it in different kinds of ways, in the ways in which we were labeled and stigmatized, right? And so it's always interesting to me about how a nation founded on democracy, the paradox between enslavement and democracy, and pretend as if there is not a residue or legacy of white supremacy that's still being enacted within our policies and our practices, our programs, and in our institutions. We just saw white nationalism in mass in the attack on the Capitol. White supremacy at large, right? It was almost like a movie, and so it's very interesting how they want to position themselves, and when I mean they, meaning proponents of this color blindness, right? This is what this is emerging from, that, and they co-opt, King's message that we will be judged by the content of our character, right? Not our skin. And they completely misappropriate that, right? Because if you're asserting that you want to be judged as a human and of dignity and integrity, it's because you haven't been treated that way. The fact you have to assert that is because you haven't been treated that way, because your subjectivity has been racialized, right? And so I think that for those who are advocates for social justice work, have to be clear about explaining to individuals that critical race theory traces and tracks the effects of everyday ordinariness of racism. There's nothing taboo about that. That's just a fact, right? Racism is a natural part of society. Yeah, that's not Disneyland material. That's just stating a fact. And if it's a normal part of society, right, how did it get that way? Who promoted the narratives by which that social reality exists? How do we demystify that reality with other narratives, right, to have a more complete narrative about not only the treatment of of persons of color, but about what we want to imagine of what we want to see. You know, that's what critical race theory does, it seems to me, right? And it gives a fuller account of history that's often left out. And so for me, to erase critical race theory is to continue to reproduce and reify white normalized ways of thinking about history, culture, and society. And that's what we have to vigorously challenge.
Right. One of the things I noticed is when these conversations are happening, when they put it out there, you're right. It's almost like, you know, sort of it's a straw, first off, sort of the straw argument, first and foremost, but it's becoming this code for, you know, everything that is problematic, everything that is Black. So it's almost just like critical race theory, Black Lives Matter. Whenever you put up these things, and now they're political. So we've politicized now, you know, a social movement. We've politicized, you know, a theory, and all of this is to do, just like you're saying, to create this narrative, really. And again, the interesting part of this narrative is that the narrative is inherently anti-folks of color, specifically anti-Black. And at the same time, their attack on the other end privileges certain Black folks and certain perspectives if you've accepted this, you know, sort of dominant narrative of America, the dream versus the nightmare. If you accept the dream, then you're okay. But if you expose the nightmare, you're a problem. And you're over here on the bad side. The other thing I was thinking about, Dr. Prier, was the idea that there is no detailed explanation of CRT. So we don't talk about counter narratives and challenging the dominant narratives. And we don't talk like you just did, this idea when we say the permanence of racism, people sort of hear that when they're like, well, that's just, you know, that's not hopeful. That's just an unhopeful message. Well, why is it that so many folks of color, when they hear the permanence of racism, like, yep, and that's the truth. It just like you said it. Or when you try to explain things like interest convergence, right? You know, or how these things converge on how, you know, and people talk about progress and how things have progressed. It's like, well, when the things actually did progress at those moments, who benefited and who benefited more from the way that they came together? You know, so CRT, I believe, it's a tool for getting into all those things. Part of my issue on this too is the attack is on the tools that we use,
yes,
to expose and analyze race. Yes. So now it's like we're going to, you know, now we're going to attack your movement, and we will now attack the tools you use. We're now but let's look at the logical road. If we're going to do that, then eventually we're also going to have to attack those who utilize these tools. Yes. So it's a clarion call to folks who use CRT. And by the way, it can't stop at CRT, because that's just one. There's critical theory, there's lectrit, there's, you know, there's branches. Yes. All critical theories are at risk now.
Absolutely.
And the last thing I'll say on this, and I said this in a conversation with colleagues recently, CRT is just a canary in the mine. If they go after critical theories, they'll go after other theories. Don't think quantitative methodologies are safe. They're not safe. Everything is on the table, because the true goal could be to attack logic and history itself, right? To take that off the table. And we've seen this in current politics, this whole rejection of logic, the rejection of history, the rejection of crafting, you know, a careful argument. And once we do that, I mean, that's basically the university. We're the place and the space for all of that. Yeah. So I think it is a particular challenge for us. And I just really hope that we will use our voices to really push back against this, because I see this as a real problem.
No, it's imperative. And I will say the hope that I see in the students that I'm working with today at the undergraduate and graduate level, they are, in my estimation, much more malleable to have difficult conversations about race, about white privilege, about gender, right? They're much more about homophobia, right? Within the LGBTQI plus community, right? So they're much more malleable and ready to have these conversations than maybe 10, 15 years ago. 10, 15 years ago, to introduce these topics and be very explicit about what you're doing, there was much more of a hesitation, right, to engage that without the fear or being viewed as a radical professor. And so that's the hopeful piece about it. And the other piece is where I feel that we're at today is that I would like to believe, just as we've had white allies in the Black Lives Matter movement, I think we'll have white allies in this particular movement to preserve critical theories, right? Critical social theories. Because to attack critical scholarship and research is to essentially attack anything related to equity or justice work, right? So these are indispensable to equity and justice work. So there are many people who are writing in it that might not even call it critical this or critical that, but we all know the foundations historically, again, around the 1950s, 1960s, and 70s of where this work emerged. And so I agree with you. We have to be vigilant and be on careful watch for where this movement is. And my hope is that, you know, with the current Biden administration, who has, you know, a wife who is an educator, that she, you know, she will be sensitive to what's going on, as well as the Secretary of Education. So, so we'll see what happens, but this is something that definitely we have to be on guard for, because there are implications around what K through 12 education looks like, what you know, our scholarship and research looks like, and the kind of work that we do and how it's accepted and things of that nature. And so I definitely think that what seems small right now in Idaho, if it's not checked, it could expand. And I think, Dr. Beachum, that's what you're getting at, is we don't want to see a mushrooming of this, you know, across the country.
Right, and of course, this is not the first time. You may remember a few years ago, the state of Arizona tried to ban ethnic studies, which started a whole another kind of blow up. So every few years or so, this thing sort of bubbles up, right?
HB 2281. Yep.
Yep. Tashina, we only have time for like a couple more questions. Take your pick.
Yeah. All right. So thinking, and I wish we could just continue on and on. Maybe we'll have to have you on again, Dr. Prier. Thinking about the justice and equity related work. What actually, how can we unite people and communities when they've become so physically, emotionally, and mentally divided?
Absolutely. Great question. And I almost think that this question, it almost is related or interrelated to the movement with Idaho. So obviously we are in a very racially polarizing moment, if that's what I'm getting from in terms of the desire to unify, right? And so, you know, one of the things that I think about within this past election, although President Trump lost, 75 million people voted for him. That's the largest in the history of the Republican Party, if I'm not mistaken, right? And so that's a moment in which, for at least the way I see it, back to unification, where we as professors in the field of education and teachers in K through 12 schools, that's a moment where I think that we see this moment of polarization as a moment of opportunity, because anytime that you can see, where that administration campaigned its popularity off of race baiting, right, and creating divisions across different racial and ethnic and linguistic groups, and the fact that 75 million people championed his cause means there's a whole lot of work to do. While we have progressed, obviously, since the founding of this nation, but there's so much more work to do. And so the question becomes, again, where does the opportunity lie to unify? And the opportunity to unify is to educate. But the only way in which we could truly produce the kind of education that we're talking about is to have these very rich conversations around race and around culture, right? And around ideology, and around the ways in which the marking of identities in particular ways influence certain kinds of practices of how certain students are treated versus others. And so it's, for me, unification has to be through education, and a critical education, and how are we not just producing students as persons who can get through the technical competencies of math and science and English, and right, with all the different, your subjects and your content is wonderful, but it's the for what for me, right? What is the purpose by which we are teaching them? Are we teaching them to be students as critical citizens? Because these are going to be the persons who will be your next teachers, your next judges, your next lawyers, your next business folk, right? They will be running the world at some point. What kind of decisions will they make, and what will be the value judgments behind the decisions that they make, and whose lives, right, will that impact? Well, it starts in our K through 12 school systems. And for me, it's unification through education. Otherwise, people will continue to be harmed by what others don't know. People will continue to be harmed by what others don't know. So it's not enough to just say, I didn't know, or I lived in this particular community and so I didn't know, right? Well, you not knowing, right? We can give you that, but it's not just enough to be there. Start where you are, but don't stay there, as Richard Milner talks about, right? So others can be harmed by what you don't know. And so what do you do with what you don't know? Because lives are at stake by what you don't know. And so if there's true reconciliation, if there's to be true unification, there has to be a critical education that's designed to fill in the gaps. One of the things I often say is that we today, right now, all of us in this particular space and the students that we teach and prepare may not have produced the history that we see that has come before us, but we inherited the good, the bad, and everything in between. We've inherited it. And so what do we do with a history that we have inherited for the future? That's a choice now. Moving forward, that's a choice about our agency, about how we want to remake history toward a new kind of future. And so it's, do we have the will? Do we have the capacity, right? Do we have the integrity? Do we have the ethics to make the right choices for a greater good? That seems to be, Tashina, the start of how we think about unification. I know that's probably a longer answer, but to me, at least that seems to be where I think we need to start as we think about that question.
Man, excellent, man. Look, there was one more question kind of around how do you continue to grow and learn as an educational leader, but actually, and I was going to give you the opportunity because I know we're bumping up against the time here. It's about 3:15. did you have any other last words for our audience to take, last encouraging words to take with them as they go on about either their own investigation and interrogation into, this kind of work, or if they're interested, maybe we have some people out there who are interested in starting their own journey down the road of educational equity. Do you have any words, recommendations, resources for those folks?
First, I would say support this podcast. I believe in platforms like this immensely. What is happening now is a public form of education. What's happening now is the continued development of a critical consciousness about the current moment in which we're situated that has been fragmented around race and culture and history. We're developing a critical consciousness about the contradictions that exist between claims of equality and lived realities of inequality, right? So we're attempting to demystify those contradictions in this moment, in this space. And so I believe in these particular formats also as a form of public education beyond the traditional bricks and mortar of schools. Secondly, for those who are interested in social justice work, is to become familiar with the language and the discourse around justice work. And it would incumbent you to immerse yourself in some version of critical social theories, right? Some call it critical theories, some call it critical social theories, but that would be one strand I would recommend folks to really get immersed in of what that epistemological perspective. I would also recommend people to become versed in critical race theory to really understand what it's trying to say, right, and not say, versus what you've been hearing from the mainstream. I would also, for those who are interested in culturally relevant or culturally responsive education, right, look up the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings and Geneva Gay and Richard Milner and so many others, William Tate, right? There's so many who have done incredible work in this area to learn about the fact that it's about academic achievement, right? But it's also about cultural competency. So if you're looking to be situated in a diverse education and educational environment, right? What does it mean for you to be a culturally competent educator? What does it mean for you to examine your own identity, right? If you are a future white teacher or a school leader, what does it mean for you to examine your own cultural identity in relationship to the students that you serve? And so that's going to require examination that you probably haven't done, right? So how do you examine your own story, right? And what are the silences and gaps of what you don't know? And then how do you fill in those gaps? The other piece of culturally relevant pedagogy is how do you relate your pedagogy to some larger social and political context, right? Toward the empowerment and social justice ends of students who have been underrepresented, under-resourced, and underserved. So there's a larger ethic of the so what. So in addition to being competent, in addition to mastering academic achievement, is the so what, like how is this connected to the larger world? And that's important because our students from these vulnerable communities have to interact with a world that has been less kind to them. And so it's not enough to just simply say, I thought being a teacher, I could just deal with the technical competencies without dealing with some of the sociological realities of our students, and to develop some empathy around that, and to develop some scaffolding about what their lived reality means for how I need to think about my curriculum and my pedagogy, right? So I would encourage people to get familiar with culturally relevant education, right? And so that's a start, right, Dr. Beachum, if they could begin to get versed in at least some of those particular discourses, to begin to, particularly if you are a budding scholar or researcher, right, who's interested in these issues, is to really get versed in some of that. And then as you continue, you'll get deeper, right? And the final piece that I would say is to get involved in your local community. You know, parents and families and kids have so much to say about what they would imagine is a more equitable education. And that conversation might look very different than the conversation you're having with your colleagues, right? And so, but if you're never interfacing in the local community, and I realize we've been in this COVID moment, so there hasn't been as much opportunity to do that, but we're hoping in the fall, some of that's going to change. And as we begin to open up spaces where we can get back out on foot, is to really immerse yourself in the local community. One of the things that I've done is, as you all saw, I'm a co-founder of Project Hope. And that's a project that I was very proud of because it really sensitized our students who are going to be future teachers and educational leaders to the impact of poverty and homelessness on students who are encumbered within those particular realities. And so we literally are in local homeless shelter sites. And we are literally having class in those homeless shelter sites to get some sense that this is not a matter of lazy people. Their eyes open when they suddenly find out of how people can become homeless or are situated in issues of poverty. And, you know, and so, but in order to understand that, you have to be on the ground with the community. You have to begin to learn about their narratives. And part of what I think is really important to say is that understanding communities' narratives is not just about sitting around and hearing a bunch of stories. This is not soft science. This is very rigorous work to interrogate what are the implications of those narratives around your leadership practice. What are the implications of those narratives around how do you need to continue to refashion curriculum and pedagogy, right? So this is not just about, let me sit around and just understand you. No, it's how do those narratives inform the reimagining and the reshaping of how we think about K through 12 schools. And that's much more time. That's not an efficient process, but I think it's a great one. And it's one that we need to be seriously rigorous about. And I think it's going to deepen our learning. And that's what I'll say. And to continue to press, even in us as we have a graduate student here and 2 professors, never settle of thinking that you know it all, that there's always something that we are always in this honest, you know, Prier talks about this unfinishedness, right? This unfinished project. We're always in that state of critically interrogating what we don't know for what we need to know as we try to move toward this project of possibility. And so stay in that posture, you know, and I think at least that's a start.
Well, that's a start. That's a direction. That's some goals. Again, we want to thank Dr. Darius Prier, our guest, for joining us today on the Education for the 21st Century Facebook page. We'll go up and let's put up Dr. Prier's information up there to his website. And you made me think about some things. Maybe we need to toss up some CRT resources of our own, culturally relevant pedagogy resources and culturally relevant leadership and culturally responsive leadership. For more on culturally responsive leadership, check out the work of Dr. Muhammad Khalifa, who's leading the way in that particular work. If you're interested in culturally relevant leadership, Dr. Carlos McCrae, Dr. Miriam Mazzani, and Dr. Floyd Beachum, among others, who are also doing that important work. We want to thank the viewing audience for joining us today, folks, from wherever you are on the globe. We hope you are being safe. We hope that this conversation was informative. Tashina, thank you once again for everything you did to get us together for today. Dr. Prier, got some last words?
Just want to add one more thing. For those of you who are interested more in prophetic criticism, There's an article that I have out in Equity and Excellence in Education. It's situating educational leaders as prophetic critics in Black popular culture. And then it's also in the last chapter of The Media War on Black Male Youth in Urban Education, also a text that I have published. So if you all are interested in that, just wanted to present those as resources as well.
No problem. I tell you what, if you send those to Tashina, those resources, matter of fact, any resources,
Okay.
we'll get those up on the Facebook page.
Absolutely. Thank you for letting me get that in. Sorry about that.
Oh man, that's not a problem. Tashina?
And I guess too, maybe as we're entering these spaces and as we're entering these discussions, and if you're new to this journey, it requires selfless humility and being able to really step aside and let go of one's ego. So as we're entering and learning more, just keep that in mind. That may be helpful.
Oh, well stated, well stated. All right, folks. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We will see you next time on Education for the 21st Century. We got a lot of episodes that are coming back to back. And like I said, we'll get them out as soon as possible. But folks, again, this was a very special one. So we want to, again, one more time, thank our guest, Dr. Darius Prier, Duquesne University. Say hello to all the great folks at Duquesne for us. Great institution. And for everyone, we will see you next time on our next iteration of the show. Be well, be safe, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.